Indiana bats are amazing creatures. The Indiana bat is named after our state because it was first discovered here in Indiana. It has a very large range. It can be found all the way up into New England, down into northern Georgia, and all the way across to Iowa and Oklahoma. So historically, about a third of all Indiana bats can be found here in Indiana. Here in Indiana, we have about anywhere from 8 to 12 different species of bats. Identifying bats can be easy for some and very difficult for others. Some bats, like the common eastern red bat, is very easy to tell. It's blaze orange. You can tell it from, a mile away. Indiana bat, however, is one of the more difficult ones to identify. The Indiana bat is very, very similar to the little brown bat. They're almost identical in size and shape. And literally one of the ways that you tell them apart is looking at toe hairs. And so the Indiana bat has short toe hairs. The little brown bat has long toe hairs. There's a couple other features. There's a subtle difference in their color. And also there's a little tiny projection on the rear trailing edge of their wing that we can look at. And really those three things are the only way that you can tell those species apart. So Indiana bats are a little bit different than other bat species that we have in our area. They form large maternity colonies during the summer and then gather in huge numbers in the winter hibernation sites. But probably what makes them most different is that they really don't tolerate humans very well. They prefer to be out in the forested areas away from people where the influences of people don't really bother them. But probably the biggest issue with them is human habitat destruction and disturbance. And because of that, the Indiana bat's not doing very well. As a bat biologist, one of the things I do is study bats. And the way that we study bats most commonly is we go out and actually use these very large nets to catch bats. And when we catch the bats, we do this for a few reasons. One is to look at the animals themselves and to get an idea of their health and to find out if these animals are reproducing correctly and if they're healthy in all the other different ways that you can imagine an animal would be. The other thing that we often do when we catch these bats is we will study them. We apply tiny little radio transmitters and we glue these onto their back with a little surgical glue. And then the bats will fly around with these transmitters on them. We can follow them for up to 2 weeks and get a better understanding of where these bats go and what they do so that we have a better idea of how we can help these animals so they can survive. Primarily when we're trying to catch the bats with these nets, we have to think like a bat. Where would bats go? And bats primarily forage down corridors. So they might be foraging down a road or down a creek. Streams and small rivers are excellent places to catch bats, and so we frequently put the nets across those rivers. When we're down near Bloomington, we'll be netting for bats, trying to understand where do these bats go, what kind of areas do they use, what's the size of the area, the home range that they use, and trying to figure out where these bats go in relation to not only their everyday lives, but also in relation to things like habitat management. Down in that particular area, we've got some forest management going on where they're doing some cutting for timber, and we're trying to understand how might that affect these animals. Do they avoid those areas? Are they actually attracted to those areas? And using radio telemetry on these animals, we can answer some of those questions. Indiana bats are endangered, so it does make them very difficult to catch. We usually catch 6 or 7 species when we're out netting, and usually the Indiana bat's one of the least common of all of those that we catch. In a particular summer, with all the netting we do, and we do a lot of netting, we can usually catch a half a dozen to maybe a dozen animals, which normally we'll catch over 300 different bats during the entire summer, so you can see that there's not a very high number of those animals compared to all the rest. So one of the really neat things about Indiana bats is, like all bats, they hibernate, but Indiana bats are a little different than other bats when they hibernate. Indiana bats will cluster in large groups on the ceilings of these caves and mines that they hibernate in. They can pack in really tight. Kind of think of the New York subway station, right? They can pack in where you have 500 bats packed into 1 square foot. That's a lot of animals in a very small place. Some of these clusters can actually get to the size where there are thousands and thousands of bats all together in one cluster. Another unique thing about Indiana bats and all bats is that they're actually very long-lived for such a small animal. A typical mouse or other rodent might only live 1 or 2 years, but bats can live a very long time. Indiana bats typically live at least 10 years. The record for an Indiana bat is over 20 years, which is pretty amazing. The record for all of the bats in the eastern United States is actually held by the little brown bat, and we recently found one that was over 40 years old. One of the big problems that bats are facing, and especially the Indiana bat, is a disease called Whitenose syndrome. Whitenose syndrome was accidentally introduced to the United States back in 2006. This disease has killed millions of bats since that time. And what this disease is actually a fungus that grows on the bats while they're hibernating. And the bats aren't used to having a fungus grow on them in hibernation. And so what that causes the animals to do is to wake up in the middle of hibernation when they otherwise wouldn't be waking up. And that uses up a lot of energy reserves. And the whole point of hibernation is to save your energy all winter long. And so this disease actually causes the bats to use up their energy before the end of the winter, and they starve to death before springtime. And of course, that's a big problem for bats. This disease has been documented to have mortality rates of anywhere between 80 and 95% for bats. And so that's huge. And with animals that reproduce so slowly, they can't bounce back quickly like other species might be able to. Obviously, as scientists, we're working really hard to try to come up with a cure for whitenose, but it's a very, very challenging prospect. It's a fungus, and funguses are really hard to deal with. I personally have been working on a treatment. It won't be a cure, but it'll be a treatment to hopefully offset the fungus. We've been working on that since 2011, and it's promising, but it certainly isn't going to be the silver bullet that fixes this. So there's a couple different things that local people can do to help bats in general. First thing that you can do is become educated. And so understand bats, understand what bats need, understand that bats aren't evil creatures. That's a really important step in making sure that we conserve this particular species as well as all bats in general. The other thing you can do on the local scale is to protect habitats, restore habitats. One of the biggest problems for Indiana bats and other bat species is a loss of habitat. And that loss can come in two forms, not only physical loss of habitat, conversion into Walmart parking lots and things of that nature, but also in the degradation of our habitats. Bats are important to the environment for a whole bunch of different reasons. On the local scale here in Indiana, bats eat a lot of bugs, and those bats eating all those bugs can save farmers millions of dollars in pesticide use that they'd otherwise have to use. On the global scale, bats are really amazing in the things that they do. Not only do they control insects like they do here in Indiana, but in other parts of the world, they're also massively important pollinators and agents for reforestation. And so between the two of those, they're responsible for reforesting a lot of our tropical rainforests. They're responsible for pollinating a lot of plants, including the agave, which is really important for tequila. And so it's another reason why bats are really important.